Well, folks, I think we can get started now. Welcome to the last in the series of 3 short webinars for veterans. My name is Rex Dufour, and I'll be hosting this webinar, Investing in Your Soils, the Role of Organic Matter in Soil Function. I head up NCAT's California office in Davis, California. Just a reminder that we're planning a week-long Arm to Farm in-person training in San Diego area in late April 2022. So stay tuned to the Arm to Farm page. And also just a little bit of background on myself. I've been working for NCAT, which is our nonprofit, National Center for Appropriate Technology, since 1994. That's last century for you young folks. And then I'm married into a farm family. They're organic farmers, and I've been observing that farm for years. I spent some time overseas working with farmers in Thailand and Laos, and came back to the US, worked for NCAT and the ATTRA program. ATTRA is a National Sustainable Ag Information Service. And then my background, I have a master's in integrated pest management, but in talking with farmers in the last 30 or 40 years, especially organic farmers, they were always talking about soils. And so I've taught myself a fair amount about soils and learned a lot about soil management from farmers, and also have trained in the International Organic Inspectors Association. They have a 3-day inspectors training, pretty intensive training. I'm also registered as a technical service provider with NRCS in California and Nevada. So anyway, that's enough about me. I just wanted to say a few words about NCAT and ATTRA. NCAT is a nonprofit organization. We have several offices scattered around the country. Our biggest project is ATTRA, the National Sustainable Ag Information Service. This is the homepage of our website. It's a really good service, especially useful for beginning farmers, if you're a beginning farmer, but also for experienced farmers. You can talk to a live person. Up here, you can see we have a toll-free number. That's for the English speakers. You can email a question in. We also have a Spanish page, and we have a Spanish helpline as well. So if you're a Latinx farmer, we have Spanish speakers in our office that can talk to you in Spanish. At least half of our staff are farmers or former farmers, and all have long experience in organic and sustainable agriculture. Our website has literally hundreds of resources on a wide range of topics, lots of different kinds of formats, publications, podcasts, videos, webinars, searchable databases. We write blogs pretty weekly, I think. So it's a really good resource for you. And finally, before we get started, I want to thank the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts for funding, and the ultimate funding is coming from the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So thank you, folks, those organizations, for funding that. And so before we get started, Margot, why don't we run those polls and we can find out who we're talking to. So if you could answer these questions, and then we'll share it, the responses. And don't forget to scroll down, because there's a couple questions down below.
you want me to go ahead and end it and share it, Rex?
Yes, please. Okay. So there's some commercial farmers. Now, Margot, if I scroll down, are you seeing that? Or do you have individual controls?
No, if you scroll, everyone should be able to see it.
Okay. How long have you been farming? There's some 5 to 10 years. Actually, so the official definition of beginning farmer is less than 10 years. So I guess everybody on this call would be considered a beginning farmer. So vegetable, fruits and nuts, nice mix of livestock and crops. What size is your operation? Okay. Great, and pretty good mix of operation sizes too. So, Margot, do you want to run that that other poll question about?
Yes, hopefully you all are seeing that now. New question. And on this one, you can choose more than one answer.
Okay. So compost is pretty popular. Manure, cover crops are equally popular to each other. No-till, okay. Not too many animals, so. Okay.
You just need to talk to me about that.
Yeah, talk to Margot, and the Arkansas office has a lot of good information about ruminants, goats, sheep, cattle. Not about giraffes, though, right?
No giraffes, but we can help you with hogs and chickens too.
Okay, very good. All right, I'm going to close that out. And then move on to the next slide. Okay. So what I'm going to be talking about today, why invest in your soils? You know, I mean, farming is tough enough as it is. Excuse me, why invest in your soils? And I'll state right now, you know, investing in your soils is important because it's kind of it's one of your main capital equipment pieces. You know? Just as you know, farmers don't hesitate to invest in equipment or buildings or, you know, training for their staff, or most farmers don't hesitate anyways. So it's important that you invest in your soils, and I'll talk about, you know, that's what kind of this whole webinar is about, ways and reasons to invest in your soil. Differences between organic / ecological nutrient management and conventional nutrient management, soil investment strategies, what role organic matter plays and how important that is, plant and soil interactions, a little bit about soil management and water, a little bit about resources. If we have time, maybe go into some soil assessment slides, but we'll see. And let me see. I'm gonna switch to a video. Now I live here in California, up in Woodland, California. And well, let me run through this slide first, and then we'll go to the video. So we need to manage the soils more as an ecology and not just a place to put NPK fertilizers. And organic matter drives soil function. It really is the critical component to how well your soils are functioning. Well-managed soils can store and cycle both nutrients and water more effectively. And also in the West here, that's really important, help protect water quality above and below ground. And, you know, we're going through some climatic changes now, and this video will underline that. Our soils just aren't ready for the stresses that climate change will bring. Now, this video, this past weekend, Sacramento, I live just north of Sacramento in a little town called Woodland. It's a farm town. This past weekend, Sacramento recorded its highest ever one-day rainfall total since record keeping began back in the late 1800s. And that was nearly 5.5 inches of rain in one day. Woodland, you know, where I live, received a similar amount of rainfall. And last year's total rainfall for Woodland, which normally we get in the neighborhood of 18 inches, we only got 4.5 inches last year. So it was pretty thin. And let me just see if this will work. There we go. All right, and you know, I took this a couple days ago. It was Sunday. It was raining really heavily. I'm not sure the narration is very good, but just watch this.
All right, we're at the October 24th, having about a 4 or 5 inch rainstorm. This is my neighbor's almond orchard. They keep it pretty bare. A lot of rainwater built up. And it's ponding, it's not infiltrating. Running off someplace. This is my property. Not to say that I've managed it just great, but you notice there's plants in the ground and there's no standing water at all, even though it's a couple feet lower than my neighbor's property. So you'd think, you know, there'd be a bunch of runoff onto our property, but there's very, very little standing water here. Even in the non-irrigated areas, the green areas are irrigated. That's where the orchard is. But even in the places that aren't irrigated, I've kept the roots in the ground, not live roots, but dead roots. Very little standing water there. And here, it's nothing but standing water. So, cover crops, or even resident vegetation, is a good idea.
Okay, so that was kind of climate change personified, I think, because last year we had very little rain. This year we got, in one day, more than we got all of last year. And scientists are predicting, you know, to expect more of the same. So I guess be prepared. On the other end of the weather spectrum, there's drought, and that's, I'm not sure what kind of rainfall we're going to get this year. Maybe that was it. Nobody knows because the weather's getting more and more erratic. But Rodale did an interesting study a few years back, and they compared the production out of an organic system compared to conventional system. And not to say organic management of soils is the end all and be all of soil management. It's not. There are some really, really good, knowledgeable conventional growers that occasionally use herbicides and some pesticides, but they manage their soils very well. But generally speaking, conventionally managed soils just don't have the support, the microbiological support in the soil that helps the organically managed soils or well-managed soils to withstand some of the stresses that are going to be coming down the pike with climate change. And that includes flood and drought. Both stresses, well-managed soils can resist those impacts better and support plant health much better. So, and the problem is, in much of North America, we're working with a degraded resource. We've been kind of mining the soil for several decades now. And most of that degradation is related to the lack of organic matter. And that has many compounding effects. It creates compaction problems. It creates anaerobic problems underneath the soil. And then also in the West here, we have some areas have problems with saline soils. And in a drought situation, particularly using groundwater, those saline situations are only going to be exacerbated. So how is ecological soil management different from conventional? Well, one thing it attempts to do is relink the carbon and nitrogen cycles because as veterans, you might be interested in this little bit of agricultural history. Haber-Bosch, these were German scientists, lived over 100 years ago, about 1911-ish or so. Haber developed a process whereby he could chemically take inert nitrogen out of the atmosphere and fix it as a nitrate. And then Bosch took that process and scaled it up to an industrial scale just in time for World War I. And so Germany was not dependent on Chilean guano for their nitrate supply to make explosives. They could make it from the atmosphere. Anyway, but that process severed the link between carbon and nitrogen, because prior to that time, farmers, whenever farmers added nitrogen in the form of manures or compost or cover crops, it was always linked to carbon. This severed that cycle, and maybe not to our advantage long term. So ecological soil management is way more dependent on healthy soil microbiology. And, we've been able, through the use of chemical fertilizers, to mask a lot of dysfunction in our soils. And that's starting to come back to bite us in the butt, because non-functioning soils don't absorb water, as you could see from that video. It doesn't store, it doesn't have the organic matter, which allows it the capacity to store water. And then also it doesn't cycle nutrients very well. So a healthy soil microbiology, which in turn makes management a little bit less precise, because you're relying on that soil biology, which is dependent on soil temperature, soil moisture. If you over-till, that destroys soil structure and soil biology. Organic matter percentage. The carbon nitrogen ratios of various inputs, including cover crops. These are all linked to the soil microbiology, and it's it requires a lot more knowledge and a lot more knowledge about the soil microbiology and managing the soil as an ecosystem, not simply as a place to till and put chemicals. Generally has slower release of nitrogen. If you're using manures, oftentimes, because plants have a certain level of requirement of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, right? And if you're applying manures, the plants can probably take up as much of the nitrogen as you apply, but relative to the applied phosphorus, their demands are much lower. And so you can have over application of phosphorus. And that has happened, in fact, in Arkansas quite a bit with a lot of livestock pasture managers apply chicken litter, right? Chicken litter is a great resource, and there's a lot of chicken houses in Arkansas. And but they've been relying on, in the past, they've relied on nitrogen demand, and we're kind of ignoring phosphorus levels. And then the phosphorus started running off into our streams, and then into which some of which flowed into Oklahoma, and Oklahoma was not happy with the algal blooms. And so anyway, be careful about, if you're using manure, monitor your phosphorus levels in your soils, because you could be over applying for phosphorus. And soil quality in an ecological management system, soil quality will build over time. What you're doing is you're building up reserves in the soil. You know, I've sampled a lot of soils in California, and their organic matter levels are low, and probably historically they've been relatively low, but not as low as they are at the present time. And they don't have any reserves. There's no nutrient, or very few nutrient reserves in the soil, owing to the fact that there's very little organic matter in the soil. And the lack of organic matter cycles back into very little water storage capacity in the soil, or the capacity to infiltrate water, as you saw in that video. So soil quality builds over time and provides returns over time. And that's why I talk about investing in your soil. You know, we've been degrading the soil for decades. You know, it's not going to return to, you know, functional soil immediately, but if you invest in your soil, you'd be surprised. You talk to a farmer, a good farmer that has invested in their soil, and you'll learn a lot. This is kind of one of my first attempts years ago, probably 2 decades ago. I took some samples of an organic soil sample from a walnut orchard not too far from my office, and a conventional, just literally across the road, a conventional farm walnut orchard, same soil type, different management. And generally aggregate stability tests, you know, you lower a soil clod into some water and you watch it kind of dissolve or not. This, I did an extreme test, and I capped these jars and put the soil in there with the water, and then shook them just to see what would happen. And on the right, that's the organically managed soil. You can see the water is a little bit more clear than the water on the left. And probably more importantly, or related to that clearness, you can see there's still some structure. There's soil clumps at the bottom of this jar. Look over here on the left, that soil, the clumps have pretty much fallen apart into their constituent sand, silt, and clay particles. Those aggregates are not stable. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, because stable aggregates are critical to having functional soil. Okay. So, what lessons from nature can be applied to our agricultural systems? And nature doesn't use fertilizers. It doesn't use chemicals. It recycles everything. So there are some lessons from nature that we can apply to our agricultural systems. Not totally, because we disturb these systems. Their agricultural systems are kind of artificial ecologies. But I think there's the potential to manage them a lot better than we have been, because we haven't been paying enough attention to the ecology of the system and managing the soils as an ecology. So regular additions of organic matter. Organic matter really drives soil function in many respects. Lots of different ways to add organic matter. The more diverse sources of organic matter, because the soil microbiology, it's probably the most complex ecology on the planet. And so there's a lot of different critters down there. Fungi, plasmodium, bacteria, actinomycetes, and a bunch of larger critters, mites, insects, various arthropods, nematodes. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the soil, in healthy soil. And these diverse inputs of organic matter, certain critters will feed on a particular type of organic matter. So the more diversity you add to the soil, the more diverse soil ecology that you'll have. I knew a grower, a biodynamic grower, and he would collect manure from everywhere. If he saw some bear scat up in the Sierras, he'd collect that and throw that into his operation. And any kind of manure he would throw into his operation. He figured, look, I'm going to throw everything in there and then let the plants decide what they want to do with it. So diverse sources, protect the soil surface. That's one of the primary principles. Either living plants or leave a mulch. If you're a small grain grower, you can harvest the heads of the grain. Maybe leave the straw and just use that as a soil protection, and it adds organic matter too. Keep soil disturbance, both physical and tillage, or chemical disturbance to a minimum. And the chemical disturbance, as I said, I worked in the tropics, really low organic matter in some of those lateritic soils, which we have here in the US too. Applying chemical fertilizers would change the pH a couple points, and that isn't good for the plant roots or any soil microbes. So the chemical disturbance, if you apply a fungicide to the soil, you're kind of impacting a whole class of soil organisms. Same thing with insecticides. So just keep that in mind. Include animals if you can. They add a lot of soil biology with their urine, their manure, and just trampling. But it has to be done right. And if you want to know more about mob grazing or intensive rotational grazing, talk to Margot and some of her cohorts. And try to match the inputs, the nutrient availability from your soils with crop demand. That's not always possible, particularly in kind of organic systems, but something to keep in mind. Now, this is unfortunately, I took this in the San Joaquin Valley, but I've seen this all over the country, vast expanses of bare soil. And, in nature, you notice if you go to the plains or forests, except in the desert, you don't see vast expanses of exposed soil. You just don't. It's not something that nature works with. And to me, this is one, it's very susceptible to wind erosion. And, with climate change, temperature differentials, wind erosion is going to become more and more of a factor all over the country, because when you have temperature differentials, you're going to have, and pressure, atmospheric pressure differentials, you're going to have higher winds. And I think we've seen that, particularly in California with our fires here, but that's not the only location where that's going to happen. And, you know, you're starving the soil. There's no roots in the ground. There's no protection for the soil. And so, you know, there may be good agronomic reasons. Maybe there's no water, you know, but, you know, we're not doing ourselves any favors by exposing or leaving such vast acreages of soil exposed to the atmosphere and to erosion and kind of starving the soil. So my apologies for the busyness of this. There's a lot of stuff going on in here, but what I want to focus on, what drive, you know, these are, the soil is kind of like a big digestive system, really complex, has a lot of different functional groups that basically cycle organic matter. That's what ecosystems do, really. But it's based on adding, you know, organic residues of various kinds. And then those organic residues are fed on by a whole range of kind of secondary consumers, you know, actinomycetes, fungi, bacteria, you know, earthworms. They'll cycle through these things. And, you know, if you add organic matter every year, you're going to, and different kinds of organic matter, you know, earthworms eat different stuff than fungi eat. And actinomycetes kind of degrade different types of organic matter than, say, some of these mold mites. But the fact is that, you know, these functional groups, they all have a role in the ecosystem, and they all secrete and cycle. And when they die, you know, their bodies, you know, are digested by other groups in the soil. And all these organisms, if you have a functional soil ecology, it slows the energy flow through the system. It becomes less leaky to nutrients as well as water. And if you picture all these like thousands and thousands of different kinds of organisms and their life cycles, you know, they're cycling, ultimately cycling organic matter, but then they're also cycling nitrogen, and they're slowing the pace of organic matter through the system. They're slowing the pace of energy flow through the system, and you're building up energy. Organic matter is nothing but energy. You know, the plants receive sunlight and they change it into kind of liquid carbon of various kinds and secrete it, a lot of it, into the soil microbiology. So, physical disturbance disturbs, you know, these bigger critters up on top first, you know. So you want to reduce soil disturbance as much as you can. And then chemical disturbance, you know, you can wipe out whole classes, fungi, insects. You can deplete whole groups of organisms by just not managing very well. So different, this is kind of a conceptual, there's a whole spectrum of organic matter inputs. You know, it's not just the hot stuff and cool stuff and woody stuff. It's a continual spectrum. But being humans, we can digest this a little bit better if it's classified. So really, the candy for soil microorganisms, raw manure, blood meal, feather meal, this is easily accessible organic matter. It has enough nitrogen that, you know, bacteria can really go to work on it. Adding that, and I would include like heavy legume cover crops. That is kind of like candy to to the soil microbes as well, because it's easily digested, readily digested. And it really helps that, kind of kickstart the soil biology. Cool stuff, that box, medium nitrogen, 1.5 to 2.5%. I would include compost, leaf mulch, some cover crops, depending on the cover crop mix. And I'll talk a little bit more about cover crops in a bit. But, you need to allow time for that, that stuff to decompose. Otherwise, you may have problems. But, if you incorporate that and give it a little bit of moisture and allow time to decompose, you're in better shape. And woody stuff, I'm talking about straw, bark, wood chips. Here in California, we have a cost share through the California Department of Food and Ag's Healthy Soils Program. It's whole orchard recycling. It's called WOR, whole orchard recycling. It's kind of a pain, but an almond, we have a lot of perennial crops here in California: walnut, pistachios, almonds, probably close to 3.5 million acres of those woody perennials. And, they don't last forever. And so after 20 years, 25 years, an almond orchard, it's pretty much done. You have the equivalent of 30 to 40 tons of carbon per acre. You don't want to burn that, really, which has been the practice in the past. We have cogeneration plants, or we used to have a bunch. They've kind of gone by the wayside these days, but you want to capture as much as possible and recycle that carbon into the ground that it came from. And so whole orchard recycling is becoming a popular practice. So, and here again, I'm going to apologize for the busyness of this, but there's a lot of talk about carbon and carbon markets and things like that. But conceptually, again, I'm going to be focusing on these pools of carbon in the soil. Here, the labile, this is the easily kind of digested pool, easily oxidized pool. But in reality, it's not, you don't have these discrete pools of carbon and organic matter in the soil. It's a spectrum, it's a whole spectrum, but there is kind of an equilibrium between these groups, these conceptual groups. If you keep on adding cover crops and organic matter every year, the labile organic matter, you'll build that up, but then also some of that labile organic matter will equilibrate or be digested or decomposed or recomposed, I guess, into some of that slow organic matter, the 10 to 20 year kind of organic matter. And then as you build up this pool, some of that will equilibrate into the stabilized organic matter, which is really stable. What we've been doing over the past several decades with our agricultural practices is we've been mining the labile organic matter. That's pretty much been evaporated. It's been metabolized by bacteria and blown off as carbon into the atmosphere. And it's been sucking down this slow organic, this middle pool, this medium stable organic matter, which in turn has been sucking into that very stable stuff that is supposed to last for, up to 100 years or more, and I would include, say, biochar and that as well. But as we build up the labile organic matter with our good practices, we'll kind of reestablish those larger pools or increase the pools of the slower and stabilized organic matter. But we haven't been doing that. We've been mining the soil for quite a few years now. So plant-soil interactions. This is, you know, a lot of beginning farmers have diversified systems. That's really good because when you consider up to about 50% of the carbon fixed by photosynthesis in plants is transferred to the root as soil exudates. And the exudates, they encourage microbial growth, they improve uptake of nutrients by plants. And these different plants, even within tomato, like if you plant a different cultivar, if you're planting Roma tomato cultivars and plant a different cultivar, maybe a heritage variety or some, you know, like big boy cultivar, those different tomato cultivars will exude a different set of chemicals, which will support a different set of microbes. So the diverse, you know, if you have diverse crop rotation, that's great. If you want to diversify the plants you put in each bed, you know, you don't want to put fennel in the same bed year after year. You want to move that around. And these are not leaks. These are not kind of passive leaks or accidental leaks. These are exudations, and they take a lot of different forms, but they're all kind of carbon-based, except for the water. Sugars, amino acids, organic acids, vitamins, all kinds of carbon products are exuded in order to support the soil microbiology, because it's kind of a, I'll scratch your back if you scratch my back. And remember, different plants exude different sets of chemicals. And, you know, the soil microbes as insects, you know, my background is in entomology. And, you know, there's insects that are generalists, you know, they'll feed on just about anything. Like Japanese beetle will eat oaks, they'll eat, you know, just about anything that's green. And then there are others that are specialists, other insects that are specialists, you know, say the cabbage maggot, you know, they'll generally just go to cabbage roots or mustard roots, you know. Same thing with microbes. There's generalists that probably will feed on any kind of root exudate. And then there's ones that are more specific to specific root exudates. And so as you diversify your cropping system, you're diversifying the root exudates that are supplied to the microbiology, and you're diversifying your microbiology. Okay, excuse me. I'm gonna, in fact, I'm gonna stop sharing my video here. An example of the complexity of plant-soil interactions, and I'm kind of getting down into the weeds here, but I just, it's important to understand just how the plants and the soil microbiology, they have these chemical signals that feed back into their respective systems, into their respective biologies. So I'm gonna kind of focus on the left-hand side of this thing, this diagram. So just an example is all. Pseudomonas syringae, that's it's a plant pathogen of tomato, and it lives in the soil. It can be splashed up onto leaves. It can infect the tomato through this open stomata here, right? And the stomata control respiration and release water, and, you know. In response to the infection, the plant releases L-malic acid. That's these little white blobs here, down here. That's a signal, you know, a response, a chemical response of the plant to the infection. That in turn is a food source for the beneficial bacterium, Bacillus subtilis, these yellow critters down here. Bacillus subtilis is actually a bacillus that has been incorporated into some antifungal foliar sprays that are commercially available, in fact. So Bacillus subtilis then in turn releases toxins which suppress the plants. These toxins are represented by these little black dots. Now, counterintuitively, it suppresses the plant's antimicrobial defenses, but at the same time, it staves off other potentially pathogenic bacteria, right? And then also it allows Bacillus subtilis to colonize the plant roots, causing the plant to produce abscisic acid, causing the plant stomata to close. Now that's just one example of one micro kind of interacting and sending chemical signals. You know, on the other half of that picture, there's an alternaria. It's a leaf spot disease of tomatoes. If one tomato is infected with that alternaria through mycorrhizal fungal chemical signaling, the mycorrhizal fungi are attached and actually infect plant roots, infect in a good way. That infection of the alternaria in one plant will send a chemical signal to neighboring plants that have connections to that same mycorrhizal network to prepare. It sends a chemical signal that activates that plant's defenses. So there's so much going on underneath our feet that we don't even know about. And just something to keep in mind, the complexity, all we can do is kind of help feed the complexity by managing the soil as an ecology. Here's a picture of, there's a root tip, and all these little white strands are mycorrhizal attachments, right? And the mycorrhizae, you notice the size, I mean, that's a root hair, right? And the mycorrhizae are like orders of magnitude smaller than the root hairs, and root hairs are pretty tiny. And so those mycorrhizae are able to access parts of the soil, like in clay aggregates and these micro aggregates and areas of the soil that the root hairs cannot access. And so it allows the mycorrhizal fungi, allow the plant to access a much larger volume of soil nutrients and water than would otherwise be accessible to only the plant root. But that only happens in healthy soils. And, you know, like I said, most of our soils ain't so healthy. This is something called an arbuscle, or arbuscle, if you don't pronounce the C as a hard C. This is where, you know, right here, this is mycorrhizal fungi, and this is where it's supplying the plant some nutrients, and then the plant is supplying some carbon products to the mycorrhizal fungi. And keep in mind, you know, like plants and these microbial associations, you know, we've been doing agriculture for maybe 10,000 years. We've been doing like chemical agriculture for just, I don't know, maybe less than a century, right? Nature has been doing stuff like this for hundreds of millions of years. So they have some knowledge. There's some like ecological knowledge they have that we might want to take advantage of. So the plant feeds the soil microbes feed the plant. It's a nice symbiosis, but only happens if you're aware of the soil ecology and know how to manage for the soil ecology. And, you know, this is just an example. This is a mycorrhizal, a dyed mycorrhizal fungal strand. It's dyed green because that indicates glomalin, which is a soil glue that's secreted by mycorrhizal fungi. And the fact of the matter is, we didn't know about this important class of compounds until the mid-90s. which I don't know, it just shows like how much we don't know about what's going on right underneath our feet. And, the only reason I'm showing this slide is sand, silt, and clay, the relative size of these particles. I've talked about how aggregation of the soil is so important. And soil aggregates are where they're like little micro ecosystems for bacteria, fungi, and nematodes and things like that. And not all nematodes are bad. There's way more beneficial nematodes than there are plant pathogenic nematodes. So just to clarify there. But we need to have the sand, silt, and clay particles aggregated, because as aggregates, they can allow soil, water to infiltrate into the soil. And it also allows air to infiltrate into the soil. If you don't allow air to infiltrate into the soil, then you're going to have anaerobic conditions, which the roots don't like because it encourages some nasty plant pathogens. But also, if you fertilized and then have a rainstorm like we just had, and then you have this seal that comes, at the first so I'm getting ahead of myself, but we want stable aggregates, and stable aggregates only happen with good soil biology, because you have the glomalins of the fungi, you have these bacterial polysaccharides that also allow the soil aggregates or the soil particles to aggregate and as stable aggregates. And you saw in that kind of aggressive aggregate stability demo I did earlier, the stable aggregates are critical to soil function. And if you have anaerobic conditions and you have a bunch of nitrogen in the soil, then those bacteria, those anaerobic bacteria, are going to start metabolizing that, and you're creating nitrous oxide as well as methane. And those are two very potent greenhouse gases. So there's a lot of bad stuff that happens with poorly managed soils. At the first sign of rainfall or irrigation droplets, poorly aggregated soils, as you saw in that little demo I did back then, a few slides back, the clay particles will go to the surface and form a seal. And thereafter, you're not going to be absorbing any rainfall into the soil, into the root zone, and ultimately into the water table. In addition, you're going to have water running off that soil surface, taking some clay particles that probably have absorbed phosphorus ions and other nutrients you've added to the soil at your own expense, taking them downstream to your neighbor or your reservoir, causing sediment problems, causing algal blooms. So not good. So aggregated soil, going back to that little aggregate stability demo I did, or virtual demo. Soil structure, good infiltration of both water and air. No soil structure, you don't get much infiltration of water or air, and it creates all kinds of problems. Okay. This is, you got to protect the soil from these little water bombs, raindrops, irrigation droplets, they, even well aggregated soil, stable aggregates, if they are punished enough with these little water bombs of raindrops, they'll disaggregate. And so you want to protect the soil surface with either mulch or living plants. Otherwise, you end up with a situation like this. This is in that walnut orchard that I took the soil sample from. Not a healthy soil. You have this real clay seal up on top, and it's not allowing air infiltration. It's not allowing water infiltration, and it just doesn't do anything for anybody, I guess. You have a situation like this. and increasing soil organic matter can help increase water infiltration into the soil, the root zone, ultimately the water table. I've seen this many times. And also the water capacity, the water storage capacity of the soil. You know, if you can increase your soil organic matter, that's this column, in sandy soil or even silt, clay, loam soil, you're gradually increasing the capacity of your soils to store water. And I think with climate change coming in, you want your soils to both infiltrate and be able to store water at much higher rates than they are now. Okay, so just to reiterate, regular additions of organic matter, diverse sources, protect the soil surface, keep soil disturbance to a minimum, chemical as well as physical disturbance, add livestock, and try and match the inputs and nutrient availability with crop demand. And I'm just going to talk about, you know, there's cover crops, you know, this is kind of lessons from nature. This is a vetch cover crop. But when you're talking about cover crops, you know, and my brother-in-law, I mean, this is at my brother-in-law's farm. He's an organic farmer. He thinks in some conversations, he's mentioned like, cover crops, they're really a pain, you know, you got to manage them and you got to, you know, I remember one year he planted a bell bean cover crop, got up to about, I don't know, 5 or 6 feet because we had some heavy rains and he could not get into the field to chop the bell beans. He had a great cover crop. It served him well for probably a couple, 3 years because there was so much biomass. But there are downsides. There's no pure excellent practice in agriculture. You know, they have costs and benefits. Cover crop considerations, though. And, you know, he plants a cover crop on beds because he follows the vetch cover with he mows it, lets it dry down, and does a light Lewiston tillage to incorporate that cover crop, and then transplants tomatoes into it. Anyway, what species are you going to pick for your cover crop? And that relates back to your goals for the cover crop. Do you want nitrogen? Do you want biomass? Are your soils so bereft of organic matter you just want to have biomass, like tons and tons of biomass? Do you want to create habitat as part of your cover crop with flowering Phacelia or, you know, California poppy, or, you know, clovers, crimson clover, mustards, good early season cover crop that flowers early. But mustards, you know, if you have a big rainfall year, like we had a few years back, and that orchard I showed you, I had 6 and 7 foot mustard plants. And, you know, I don't have big tractors or anything. I had a sling blade, and I rented some small walk behind flail mowers. So that relates back to equipment. But think about, what are your goals for the cover crop? Because that will inform your species selection. The cost, you know, you can have some really fancy habitat, you know, native wildflower seed habitat as a cover crop, but it's going to cost you because native wildflower seed can be pretty pricey, as opposed to there's commercial mixes of, you know, vetch, bell bean, and Austrian peas, you know, 50-pound bags probably cost you maybe $1.50, maybe up to $2.50 a pound. What your seeding rate is going to be, that's going to go back to your cost. If you're an organic farmer, you want to have maybe a higher seeding rate because you want to have a faster coverage, closure of the canopy, because weeds are, you know, an organic farmer, you know, they are not allowed to use any chemical herbicides. And so you need to manage the weeds ecologically, either through grazing, you know, flaming, or just smothering with cover crop. So seeding rates are important. Seeding depth. is pretty important. And then seed inoculation, if you're using legumes, really, I highly recommend getting the right rhizobial inoculant for the seed. It just works better. Are you going to drill or broadcast? You know, drilling, you can kind of lower the amount of seed rate a little bit. Broadcast, you got to raise it up because you're broadcasting, you're like putting these seeds on the soil surface. Now, if the birds don't get it, you know, I recommend if you broadcast, you know, you get your tractor and or whatever implement you have, and kind of get some fencing or something, just drag the soil, you know, do something to help incorporate, get some seed soil contact for that cover crop seed if you're broadcasting, because you'll have a much better cover crop. And the equipment to plant and manage a cover crop, seed drills, mowers, discs, roller crimpers, you know, they can all be used. And you folks, if you're going to go with cover crops, you know, it's as much of an art as it is a science, because you have to integrate your equipment, your kind of goals, and then your what you want to plant your cover crop into, or what you're going to plant after your cover crop. And the more you plant cover crops, the more knowledgeable you'll be about kind of the pros and cons of these different plant species and different years. You know, most folks in California depend on rainfall to bring up a cover crop, and that hasn't worked very well in the past, you know, 4 or 5 years because rainfall has been so erratic. But if you can irrigate the cover crop, or if you're kind of in the Midwest or East where rainfall is more regular, then you're in better shape. And reseeding, do you want your cover crop to reseed or not? You know, and I've worked with a grower to, let me see, okay. I worked with a grower to transition some conventional ground to organic. It was about 30 acres, and suggested he plant a cover crop and then allow the small grains. And there was a vetch and there was some mustards in there too. Was it tillage radish? Yeah, as a mustard. And we allowed it to reseed, and you know, it did a really good second cover crop, because I think, you know, that reseeding, we probably had, I don't know, 10,000 pounds of seeds to the acre. It was just a huge amount of seeds. But he didn't, following that second cover crop, you know, he was going to plant his diversified vegetable system, and he didn't disc the third cover crop in time. He didn't chop it before it went to seed. And so that small grain cover crop, that oat and rye combination cover crop, that became a weed. So make sure you know whether you want the reseeding or not, but you can reduce your seed cost by quite a bit by allowing it to reseed. And, you know, just think about what your goals are for that cover crop. And if you're planting a new orchard, you know, almonds, walnuts, pistachios, or even, you know, apples, I don't know where everybody is here, but especially in a new orchard, there's a lot of bare soil. You want to protect your soil resource. That's part of your capital, you know, what produces your crop. And you can even, you know, this guy, and this is a walnut orchard, he planted, it looks like wheat hay, I think. And so he could harvest this. And I bet he did end up harvesting this and baling it for wheat hay for a local dairy, you know. So sure, it would be more beneficial if he allowed that to go to seed and, you know, like incorporated that biomass. But there's a lot of roots in the ground too that he's allowed, and maybe he harvests just the grains, who knows. But there's a lot of options available to you as a kind of an ecological engineer. If you're planting on a hillside, oh, geez, this pains me to even look at. Mulching opportunity, or, you know, put in a cover crop, but NRCS has a mulch 484 practice. And if you haven't accessed Natural Resources Conservation Service programs, you might want to investigate that. This is cotton. This is killed cotton, or killed, it's a killed small grain mulch. And, you know, I'm not a real fan of herbicides. I was a former licensed pest control advisor in California, and I sprayed all kinds of stuff, and I don't want to have anything to do with that, those materials anymore. But a killed cover crop, you know, it does all kinds of good things. It protects the soil from direct sunlight. It really reduces evaporation from the soil. It maintains a good soil temperature for soil microbiology, because, you know, the temperatures in California, especially in the San Joaquin, if you have exposed bare soil, you know, it'll get up to 140 degrees, and soil microbiology doesn't really like that kind of temperature. So, yeah, this does all kinds of good stuff, and it keeps the, there's predator spiders in that mulch. There's all kinds of good critters in that mulch as well. So, and compost can kickstart soil biology. I think a lot of folks in our poll questions asked, you know, they said they applied compost. It can really kickstart a soil biology, and it's a relatively easy way to improve your soils pretty quickly. But at what rate, you know? 5 tons an acre. I've seen 10 tons an acre. The California Department of Food and Ag has a cost share that they supply up to $50 a ton, up to 68 tons an acre. I think that's a really great cost share. You know, I'd take advantage of that. How will you apply it? Do you broadcast it to the whole soil? Do you want to apply it just to the top of the beds to have that compost impact that area only? Yeah. Can you get a NPK analysis of the compost? You know, in California, there's a mill tax. Anything with an analysis with it is subject to the mill tax. So a lot of compost suppliers don't provide an NPK analysis, but if you ask them, you know, they've tested their compost. Most of them have tested their compost, and they'll tell you what the nitrogen content and probably the potassium and phosphorus as well. And manure or green waste compost. There's more and more compost operations out here in California, and probably where you're at as well. Just a warning about dairy manure can be a little bit higher in salts, and if you have problems with saline soils, you want to be careful about that. Just some resources. This is the ATTRA page. I clicked on sustainable ag topics here, and we have, I don't know, we have probably 24 different kinds of boxes, you know, but this screenshot only shows just 6 of them. But there's soils and compost down here. If you click on that, you'll come to the soils and compost page, and I would note there's you can connect directly with our Spanish soils and compost page. And then there's a listing of publications, or you can go to, you know, select videos or podcasts. But this is just a small selection of the resources that are available to you from our soils and compost site. And other resources for soil assessment and management. Web soil survey, I would recommend that. If you haven't got a soil map, you know, you can go to your local NRCS office and ask for a soil map, or you can go to web soil survey and make your own map, because you put your address in, and then you can kind of draw the outline of your farm, and then click on soil map, and then it'll generate a soil map. It'll show you the types of soil that you have on your farm. It's a kind of a first draft analysis of, you know, what kind of soils you have. And if you're doing soil samples, you know, you want to send in soil samples within a particular soil type. You don't want to cross soil types too much. Building soils for better crops. This is a SARE, Sustainable Ag Research and Education. It's a free download. It's a great book. Really good resource. Managing cover crops profitably, another SARE publication. This is also very good. Kind of gives you a general overview of like dozens and dozens of different cover crops. And Cornell has the Soil Health Training Manual. It's a free Cornell University download. So those are good resources. And then NRCS program, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, and the Conservation Stewardship Program, I'm kind of less knowledgeable, and I think a lot of NRCS field staff are less knowledgeable about the CSP. Most folks go with the EQIP, and then after EQIP, a few years on that, then you kind of graduate to CSP if appropriate. And then if you're in California, and other states are adopting these just state-based healthy soils programs where they provide cost share. But if you're a farmer in California, you need to visit this site because they're going to be opening online applications at the end of this month, or more likely early November. And there's a lot of cost share practices for hedgerows, cover crops, compost application, riparian corridors, you name it. They took a bunch of NRCS practices, probably about 20, 25 or 30 NRCS practices, and just kind of duplicated them. But I think CDFA has better cost share. So anyway, I think, yeah, I just want to leave a few minutes for any questions anybody has. Margot, have you been monitoring any questions or people falling asleep?
I don't know if they're asleep or not. I haven't really had any questions. I addressed one earlier, but there's a question. If you have relatively infertile soil, can you introduce living organisms such as the mold mites, protozoa, beetles, worms, etc.? Or if you take care of your soil through composting, etc., will these organisms naturally come?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, there's a lot of product out there like, we have humates, you know, you can add humates to the soil and, you know, it'll make it do better. But the thing with soil ecology, you know, you need the skeletal structure, you need the skeleton of the soil microbiology is organic matter. And if you start putting in organic matter, then inevitably, you know, the soil will come back. I'm not really a fan of adding product to soils other than like compost and other organic matter materials. But keep in mind what I said about diverse sources of organic matter will encourage diverse soil ecologies. But that's a good question. And I would also add that, you know, if you're kind of strapped for time and labor and money, compost is probably the quickest way to really kind of boost your soil ecology, and then maybe a cover crop after that. But don't incorporate the cover crop if, you know, I mean, there's costs and benefits to each, you know, incorporating a cover crop and not incorporating a cover crop. But if you can protect the soil surface with your cover crop, I think that's a good way to go.
Here is another question. Can you speak to the pros, cons of using, I'm assuming Mr. Birch means fish manure as fertilizer in vegetable gardens?
Yeah. You mean, well, fish manure, I think you're talking about like hydrolyzed fish. I'm not sure. Getting fish manure to, like getting fish to poop all in one place, it's really tricky. So but I think you're talking about hydrolyzed fish. And yeah, fish emulsion is a good source of nitrogen. I mean, like the Native Americans, like what I was taught in upstate New York back in last century, that they would plant, put like a dead fish next to their corn, and in the Three Sisters system, and the fish would degrade into, there's nitrogen in fish because there's protein, and there's nitrogen in protein. So yes, fish emulsion works quite well. If you're in kind of a bigger system though, fish emulsion, there's a lot of kind of particles in fish emulsion. And if you have a filter, like there's a bunch of organic strawberry growers on the coast here in California. And it turns out that if you have filters, a lot of the nitrogen is captured by the filter because the nitrogen is in the particles of the fish, right? And so if you have a filter, a lot of the nitrogen you're using as a fish emulsion is not getting out to your plants. But if you're just pouring it on, yeah, fish emulsion works quite well. Just don't overdo it, and use appropriate amounts. Kind of read the label and figure out what I mean, there's directions on the label, like for every foot or X number of plants, you should use this much.
Okay, another question that was sent to me. Can you give your thoughts on dormant or frost seeding cover crops, tips, pros, cons, etc.?
I would ask for some clarification about cross seeding cover
crops.
crops.
Oh, sorry, frost seeding.
Oh, frost seeding cover crops. Well, I would ask for some clarification on that. Like, so after a crop has been frosted, you overseed a cover crop onto that?
But, I mean, we do frost seeding in our pasture situation where, where the days are starting to warm up, but it's still below frost at night. And so just that freeze thaw cycle draws the seeds down into the, you just scatter the seeds up top.
You're talking to a Californian here, right?
Yeah, I know. You're like, what's a frost?
I mean, we do have cold weather up here, and I have a friend, Gary Romano, who farms up in Sierra Valley, which is, I think they have maybe 1 month of like growing season up there. Yeah, I think that that'll work. I mean, you have to experiment. A lot of these ecological approaches to managing your soil and your system, you have to experiment with and be creative as well. Be willing to experiment, observe, and see what happens, and then adjust. Because like how does your frost seeding, does it work every year, or have there been years that didn't work, Margot?
Yeah, and we generally use it. So I have a livestock operation, and we do it where we have fed hay to our to our cows. And so, generally there's an area that has, one, we feed hay in areas where we have poorer pastures where we need some improvement. So we're adding all of that organic matter, just the wasted hay and the manure from the animals who congregate there to eat. And then, usually that area has some damage too from heavy traffic while they're eating the hay. And so that's how we, introduce seed, or to get better pasture growth in those areas, is scatter out a mixture of grass seed and clover, usually, some clover, vetch, whatever's in our pasture mix. So it generally works well. And, we get new pasture growth in those areas.
Right. Yeah. It's going to really depend on your ecoregion and how sensitive your cover crop is to frost, especially the
Right.
germinating cover crop.
Yeah, right. Okay, there's been a couple more questions come in that I'm gonna put up, but while you're listening to Rex answer questions, I'm gonna post the evaluation poll questions so you can work on answering these questions as you listen to our final question and answers, so we can make sure and get those questions launched. Okay, so another question. So it says, my property was timberland before it was logged in 2017. Right now, if rocks can grow, it would. I've same in my place. My problem is the water table is at approximately 18 inches below surface level and land is not level. I want to level it. Would it be better to bring in fill dirt or just bulldoze to make it level?
Wow. I can understand the desire to level it. And you're talking to, like in California, just about all the cropping land has been laser leveled. And, and the result of that is sometimes you have subsoil sticking up. And then in other places that were low, you have this agglomeration of, a bunch of soil. I'm not sure how to answer that. High water tables, it depends on what you're going to plant and, what's the reason for leveling the land? Are you going to use drip irrigation or something? Or it's just, you got to be aware that you're going to bring up some subsoil that is not going to be very fertile at all. And other areas are going to, you're going to have to deal with the real variability of the soil as a result.
Yeah, I was going to say, what's your plans for the property? Yeah, kind of your question, Rex. Why do you need to level it? I'm in Arkansas. We have nothing level here, so.
Right. And I would note, like high water tables, like, so pecans, if you want to do like an orchard or something, very few trees, pecans are native, I think, to Arkansas and riparian areas in the Midwest. The reason they grow so well in riparian areas is that they do not have root hairs. And so they're not immune, but I think very, very, very resistant to Phytophthora, which is a water mold. It's a fungal disease of roots. And so they're pretty resistant to Phytophthora, and their pecans are used to kind of high water tables too. So, I mean, that's one idea. I have no idea if they want to plant like a crop.
Raised beds and high tunnels because of constant rain. So.
Oh, shoot. Well, high tunnels, like you just want to level the high tunnel area, I think.
Yeah.
You don't want to go to town on the whole property because that's going to screw up, one, your hydrology, because the less disturbance, the better, I think. But level out those areas, and then you can really focus on getting the soil in the high tunnel in good shape.
Yeah, for sure. And I can't remember I get lots of people connected to our various specialists, but our colleague Andy Pressman is really good with high tunnels and soil in high tunnels. And so he would be one to definitely talk to more, and we can get you connected to Andy to help answer those questions. And then someone had a question about the Arm to Farm training in San Diego next spring. And we will post that information on our website. Since you all have attended these webinars, we have your email. You'll be getting notification about those trainings. And as far as criteria, Arm to Farm is for veterans, and you know, this one that's in San Diego will be focused on California, the West Coast. If you are not in California, we have about, well, we're going to have, I think, 7 different Arm to Farm trainings.
There's a lot of trainings coming up
next year. And so there are opportunities all across the US to attend Arm to Farm over the next couple of years. And, you know, the main criteria is it's a training for military veterans. And then, you know, it's probably most useful if you have land or access to land, or, you know, maybe you've started growing something and are just trying to figure out what exactly you want to do and what direction you want to take your farm. But I'd be happy to answer any more questions about Arm to Farm. And we definitely want you all to apply to attend those whenever they start happening over the next year or so.
Okay, let's see. Sometimes, often, oh, good.
Maybe.
All right.
Got all the questions. There was a comment about inoculating with the correct strain of rhizobia for planting legumes.
Right, your seed supplier should have that information.
Yeah, which you had said, Rex, and that is important.
Yep. It's very important, as particularly if you haven't done a legume cover crop, or that ground has been in, you know, some other kind of crop for quite a while, or if it's kind of degraded, you definitely want to have that rhizobial inoculant in there. And you can, you know, with legumes, these bell beans or vetch, you know, you can dig up the roots, and there'll be these little bumps on the roots, these little kind of miniature balloon kind of things, and you just open them up, cut them open. And if it's pink inside, you'll know that rhizobial inoculant took, because the pink indicates the rhizobium. So anyway, Margot, thank you so much for helping facilitate this, and thank you participants for hanging in there. I know this is a kind of big information download, and hope you got something out of it. So thanks very much for your good questions too.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And we'll be in touch. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to Rex and I.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.